Rome, night, October 13th, 1943. A cold wind moves across the vast marble courtyard of St. Peter's Square. The city sleeps under blackout orders. No street lamps, no car lights, only the moon reflecting on silent cobblestones. The war has swallowed Italy whole, and Nazi patrols lurk just beyond the walls of the world's smallest sovereign state. Inside the Vatican, beneath the shadow of Michelangelo's dome, a lone Swiss guard stands watch. His polished halberd glints faintly in the darkness. Every footstep echoes. Every rustle feels like danger. Across the river, trucks rumble, engines low, headlights covered. In the Apostolic Palace, Pope Pius XII reads a classified report smuggled in minutes earlier. Hitler has issued a directive, not to threaten the Vatican, not to pressure it, to take him, alive or dead. The plan is chillingly simple. Storm the Vatican, seize the Pope, eliminate witnesses. In his private prayer room, the Pope removes his ring and places it in a small cloth pouch. Not to protect it, but to destroy it quickly if the Vatican falls, because tonight, for the first time in 2,000 years, the head of the Catholic Church prepares for the possibility of being kidnapped, and the world on the outside has no idea. The Vatican in 1943 was an island of neutrality surrounded by a sea of collapsing empires. Italy, once Hitler's proud allies, was crumbling from the inside. Allied troops were advancing from the south, pushing north through Sicily and up the Italian mainland. Germany responded violently. When Mussolini fell from power in July 1943, Hitler sent paratroopers to rescue him and re-establish control over Italy by force. Overnight, Rome changed hands. German troops flooded the city, occupying train stations, government buildings, and every major road that led toward Vatican City. The Vatican, barely 110 acres of sovereign territory, sat trapped in the middle. Hitler saw it not just as a religious symbol, but as a geopolitical threat. The Vatican had diplomatic channels to every corner of Europe. It could send coded messages through embassies, couriers, and religious orders spread across Axis territory. Even the Nazis admitted that Vatican radio and diplomatic pouches were practically untouchable. The Pope's silence frustrated Allied leaders, but it terrified Berlin. Inside Nazi intelligence reports, a disturbing phrase appeared frequently. The Pope is the Axis's greatest moral enemy. Hitler viewed the Church as an institution that could undermine him without firing a single bullet. He believed the Vatican helped smuggle messages to the Allies. He believed priests informed resistance fighters, and in some cases, both were true. In the summer of 1943, something changed. A report reached Hitler that Pope Pius XII was considering issuing a formal denunciation of Nazi atrocities, naming Germany as the aggressor, condemning racial persecution, and calling for Catholics to resist injustice. For Hitler, this wasn't diplomacy, it was war. He raged inside his Berghof residence in the Bavarian Alps, shouting to his adjutants that if the Pope publicly condemned the Reich, he would not see another day as Pope. And so an operation began. The SS called it Operazione Rabat. The mission had a clear objective: kidnap the Pope, dismantle Vatican sovereignty, and seize its archives. The idea was simple but audacious. SS troops would surround the Vatican, cut all communication, arrest key cardinals, and take Pius XII north to Germany or Liechtenstein. Once removed from Rome, Hitler believed he could strip the Church of influence and install a more compliant figure, or dissolve Vatican independence entirely. He wanted control of the Vatican's archives, diplomacy and silence, and above all, he wanted to remove the only moral authority in Europe capable of challenging him publicly. But there was a psychological component to this crisis that history often overlooks. Pius XII knew that resisting openly could cost thousands of Catholic lives. The Nazis controlled France, Belgium, Netherlands, Poland, Austria, and large portions of the Balkans. Millions of Catholics lived under Nazi occupation. A single papal statement could bring mass retaliation. He was trapped between morality and consequence. Inside Vatican corridors, tension became a constant state of existence. Diplomats noticed the change. Priests were instructed to burn documents too sensitive to survive a raid. Secret meetings were held in dimly lit rooms near the Vatican archives. A plan of last resort was drafted. If German forces breached the Vatican walls, Pope Pius V would resign instantly. He would remove himself as head of the Catholic Church, declaring, "You are no longer taking the Pope, you are taking Eugenio Pacelli, a private citizen." A pope cannot be arrested by force if he is no longer pope. It was a strategy built not on power, but on sacrifice. Meanwhile, The German command stationed in Rome, led by SS General Karl Wolff, received verbal orders from Berlin to study Vatican City's defenses. The Vatican was not protected by armies, tanks, or battalions. Only 130 Swiss guards stood between the church and the Waffen-SS. The Germans could overrun Vatican City in minutes. Yet there was one problem. Kidnapping the Pope would ignite global outrage, especially in Catholic-majority countries like the United States and Brazil, both fighting against the Axis. Even Nazi diplomats warned Hitler that such an act could push neutral countries into the war. But Hitler didn't care. Pius XII, for him, represented something worse than an enemy army. He represented a moral challenge. He represented a spiritual resistance that guns could not silence. The drama now centered on two men. Adolf Hitler, who believed force could control the world. Pope Pius X, who believed silence could save it. And while the walls of the Vatican stood still, the world outside was rapidly changing. German rule over Rome was tightening. The Allied advance was moving closer. The network of priests, diplomats, and Italian partisans working with the Vatican was expanding. The stage was set. The Kidnap operation was no longer just planning. It was preparation, because, as German forces secured every road leading into the Vatican, the question shifted from if Hitler would strike to when. The pressure around Vatican City tightened like a noose. By early September 1943, the German army controlled every entry point into Rome. Machine gun positions faced the Vatican gates. SS patrols observed comings and goings. Spotters with binoculars monitored the curtained windows of papal offices. From above, reconnaissance aircraft made slow circles, mapping escape routes. The Vatican had never been so vulnerable. Inside its walls, the leadership realized that remaining passive meant death, or worse, capture, a network. Hidden in plain sight, the world often imagines the Vatican as slow, ceremonial, bound by tradition. But during the Nazi occupation, it operated less like a palace and more like an intelligence center. Priests became couriers, nuns became code operators, diplomatic envoys became informants. The Vatican even built listening posts, tracking German radio communications inside Rome. One of the most extraordinary programs formed during this period. A hidden refugee network inside Vatican-controlled properties. Convents, colleges, and monastery basements, all over Rome. Quietly sheltered Jews, escaped Allied prisoners, and resistance members. Modern historians estimate that thousands were hidden through this system. This was not humanitarian charity. It was covert defiance of the Reich. The Vatican issued fake ID cards, baptism certificates, and food vouchers under assumed names. Vatican radio selectively transmitted coded messages, phrased as harmless religious announcements, to Catholic resistance networks in Poland, France, and Belgium. To German intelligence, this was espionage, and the more Vatican activity grew, the angrier Hitler became. The Pope's intelligence web information flowed to Pius XII from places most dictators overlook. Confessionals, hospitals, clergy traveling between cities, diplomats embedded in Axis capitals. Priests were not soldiers, but they heard everything. A parish priest in Florence heard rumors of deportation trains. A bishop in Krakow described mass executions. A nun working as a nurse saw the tattooed numbers burned onto Jewish prisoners' arms. Reports landed on the Pope's desk daily. They were not rumors. They were witness accounts. A secret Vatican file now held enough evidence to condemn the Reich publicly. And Hitler knew it. The diplomatic tightrope. The Vatican's neutrality, in theory, protected it. In reality, it isolated it. The Pope could not take up arms. He could not call citizens to revolt. He could not align with the Allies without destroying the Church's diplomatic presence in every occupied nation. Every move risked civilian lives. British diplomats pressured him to speak out. German forces threatened to retaliate if he did. American leaders demanded a moral stand, but the Pope saw what they didn't. A public denunciation meant immediate bloodshed for Catholics trapped behind enemy lines. His strategy became one of quiet resistance, not open confrontation. Documents would be destroyed, not captured. People would be hidden, not named. Lives would be protected, not counted for propaganda. To outside critics, his silence looked like cowardice. To those he protected in Rome's shadowed basements, silence meant survival. Meanwhile, SS General Karl Wolff, a man feared even by other Nazis, was refining the kidnapping operation. His task was to assess Vatican defenses and strike when given the order. Through surveillance, Wolff noted one thing clearly. The Vatican had no military barrier, no anti-tank guns, no machine gun emplacements, just ceremonial guards with halberds and pistols, a symbolic army facing a mechanized empire. Wolff reported to Berlin, "The Vatican can be occupied within hours." Hitler was pleased, but the German high command was nervous. Wolff's plan required violating neutral territory. It would be equivalent to attacking Switzerland, unleashing diplomatic catastrophe. Even hardened Nazis feared the global backlash of abducting the Pope. Still, Hitler pushed. He wanted the archives. He wanted silence. He wanted power over history. Inside the Vatican walls in late 1943, the Vatican drafted an emergency protocol. If Nazi troops breached Vatican City, the Swiss Guard would not fight. They were not going to die in a hopeless defense. Instead, the Pope would walk to the courtyard, remove his ring of authority, and declare, "I am no longer Pope." A private citizen could be arrested. The Pope could not. It was the only move left, and yet, they still waited. No one knew the exact moment the Reich would strike. The battleground of Rome was changing. The Vatican was no longer surrounded by a confident occupier, but by a desperate army unraveling under the weight of defeat. In the struggle between Hitler and the Pope, the advantage shifted, not because of armies, not because of force, but because the Vatican waited long enough for the Reich to collapse under its own weight. The walls still stood, but the real test of men, morality, and power was just beginning. Hitler's obsession with power over faith to Hitler. Religion was not just a belief system, it was competition. The Catholic Church reached into every German-occupied country. It had influence over families, schools, hospitals, and moral conscience. It commanded loyalty that no dictator could fully control. In Hitler's worldview, a single pope in Rome was more dangerous than 1,000,000 Allied soldiers. In private conversations recorded by his inner circle, Hitler raged that Christianity had infected Europe with weakness, mercy, compassion, morality. He told his staff that the Church had taken the strength from mankind and dreamed of replacing religion with state worship. The Vatican threatened that dream. Every time, Pius V issued a subtle statement condemning violence or injustice. Clergy across Europe recognized it as a message against Nazi brutality. Resistance networks used Catholic confessionals as safe spots to exchange documents. Priests smuggled intelligence across borders disguised as liturgical paperwork. Berlin viewed this as treason. Inside Nazi strategy memos, one line kept appearing: "The Pope is the only voice we do not control." To Hitler, control was everything. He could silence journalists. He could censor radio broadcasts. He could shut down political parties. But he could not silence faith. The Vatican didn't need guns. It had followers, and to Hitler, the existence of a powerful idea he could not dominate was unforgivable. That obsession led to the darkest decision: kidnap the Pope. The man chosen to capture the pontiff to execute the plan. Hitler chose an SS officer who understood both intimidation and diplomacy: SS General Karl Wolff. Wolff was polished, articulate, and breathed loyalty to the Reich. He had a unique skill, the ability to speak elegantly while planning atrocities. He was not a battlefield commander. He was a strategist. Wolff's orders from Hitler were clear and unambiguous. Enter Vatican City. Arrest Pius XII. Remove him from Italy. Kill resistance if necessary. Wolff studied the Vatican carefully. He measured distances between courtyards and gates. He mapped internal hallways in the Apostolic Palace. He timed the Swiss Guard's shift changes. He discovered a vulnerability. There was no standing army, no tanks, no artillery, only tradition and faith. In his later post-war testimony, Wolff revealed Hitler's exact wording: "I want the Pope brought to Germany. The Vatican must not become an enemy intelligence center." He was expecting a quick, bloodless seizure, but Wolff hesitated. Why? Because he understood something Hitler had ignored. A pope abducted by Germans would ignite global fury. Catholics in America, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, millions of them, would demand retaliation. Neutral nations might enter the war. Cities would riot. Wolff sensed disaster. He began delaying the operation, requesting more time for planning. He pretended logistics were not ready. He blamed transportation, troop availability, Rome's unstable situation. Privately, he hoped circumstances would make the order irrelevant. But Hitler wanted pressure, and in that pressure, a dangerous countdown began. Fear within the Vatican walls. While Hitler planned domination, the Vatican planned survival. Vatican officials debated a grim question: If the Pope is kidnapped, who leads the Church? Legally, if the Pope was taken captive, the Nazi regime could present him as a collaborator. They could force him to make public statements. They could dismantle Vatican neutrality from inside. The solution was radical. If Germans crossed the Vatican threshold, Pope Pius XII would resign on the spot. He would cease to be Pope. He would become a private citizen named Eugenio Pacelli. A private citizen held hostage cannot speak for the Church. The College of Cardinals, protected outside Italy, would then elect a new pope in a neutral country. The Church would remain intact, and Hitler would be left with nothing but a prisoner. This plan was never announced. It was written quietly, hidden securely, and known to only a few key advisors. One cardinal described the atmosphere inside Vatican City as the silence before a hurricane. Priests slept fully dressed, ready for a midnight evacuation. Swiss guards were trained on how to barricade hallways long enough for the Pope to escape to the basement shelter. In a locked drawer near his study desk, Pius XII kept a small brown pouch. Inside, his papal ring, his seal of authority, instructions. For destruction, if captured, centuries of tradition prepared the Church for ceremony. War forced it to prepare for erasure. Three forces now converged. Hitler's ideological obsession, Wolff's operational planning, the Vatican's quiet resistance and resignation strategy. The question was no longer whether Germany could take the Pope. They could. The real question was, would Hitler risk the explosion that would follow? The walls had not yet been breached. Rome had not yet exploded, but the next decisions would determine everything. Whether the Vatican survived the war or vanished from history. The moment when hesitation would turn into action was approaching. The Italian resistance and Allied intelligence Rome was not passive. Beneath its ancient streets, resistance networks were forming. They communicated through bakeries, barbershops, and courtyards where laundry lines acted as signal codes. Catholic priests were not the only ones carrying information. So were tram conductors, postal workers, and university students. When German officers entered cafes, conversations stopped mid-sentence. When SS patrols appeared, shutters quietly closed. The Vatican became the nerve center of a hidden coordination effort. Italian partisans smuggled intelligence through confessional booths. British MI6 operatives used priests as cutouts to deliver coded reports. American OSS agents disguised as archaeology students observed troop movements. The Vatican served as the exchange point, neutral territory, where spies could pass intelligence that otherwise could not be transmitted through radios or telephones. One OSS operative wrote in his report, "The Vatican is neutral only on paper. In practice, it is the busiest intelligence hub in Rome." The Germans sensed information was leaking to the Allies. They just didn't know how deep it went. The resistance also monitored rumors about Hitler's kidnap plan. They confirmed troop movements around the Vatican, counting trucks and mapping patrol routes. When too many SS units gathered on Via della Conciliazione, couriers rushed messages through Vatican gates. Resistance leader Giuseppe Moretti recalled, "The Vatican did not ask us to fight, but they did not ask us to stop." The people of Rome understood that if the Pope were taken, their city's spirit would go with him. Angle 5. Inside the Pope's moral battlefield, speak or stay silent. For Pius XII, the crisis was not military or diplomatic, it was moral. He faced a question no Pope before him had confronted. Do you speak, knowing that speaking will get people killed? Millions of Catholics lived under German occupation. Churches, convents, and seminaries were packed with Jews hiding under false baptism names. Resistance networks used monasteries to store weapons and medicine. One public condemnation from the Pope could trigger mass executions, so he chose a strategy hated by some historians and misunderstood by many critics: silence, not cowardice. Calculated, deliberate silence, a silence designed to protect the hidden. Inside the Apostolic Palace, advisors begged him to flee. American diplomats urged him to take shelter with the Allies. Cardinals pressed him to denounce the atrocities directly. Each time, his answer was the same: I will not abandon Rome. Silence was not weakness. Silence was presence. In one private memo to his secretary, he wrote, "If I speak, I sacrifice the innocent. If I remain, I save them." That decision shaped the destiny of thousands hiding in Rome. Convents sheltered children who never learned their real names until after the war. Monasteries hid Allied pilots, dressing them as monks. Church-run hospitals admitted Jews under invented Latin surnames. stamping medical charts with fake diagnoses. Silence saved them. History later argued whether he should have spoken louder. Those who survived the war, buried in hidden rooms and basement crypts, understood why he didn't. Silence was his weapon. Presence was his defiance. There was one more secret angle, one almost unknown to the outside world. If German troops stormed the Vatican, Pius XII would not run. He would strip the Nazis of their entire objective in a single sentence. The moment German soldiers crossed the border, he would declare, "You are taking Eugenio Pacelli. The Pope no longer exists." It was the ultimate strategic trap. If Hitler wanted to kidnap the Pope, he would have to kidnap a man who was no longer Pope. With that declaration, Vatican sovereignty would shift automatically to the College of Cardinals, who had already prepared escape routes across neutral Spain and Portugal. A new Pope would be elected in safety. The Church would survive. Hitler would be left holding nothing. The Vatican did not plan to fight the Reich. It planned to outmaneuver it. By the end of 1943, the situation was a complex stalemate. Hitler had the force. The Vatican had the plan. The resistance had the intelligence. The Vatican could not defeat the Wehrmacht, but the Reich could not kidnap an idea. The walls of Rome were about to crack, and the moment for hesitation was ending. The next chapter would bring the storm, troops, orders. A raid that almost happened. The decisive moment, when plans became action, was about to erupt. Rome, September 1943. Germany had taken the city. Within 72 hours of Mussolini's fall, armored vehicles rolled past ancient fountains. Tanks rattled through narrow alleyways lined with centuries-old stone. German troops replaced Italian guards at checkpoints. Roadblocks went up at every bridge crossing the Tiber. The Third Reich now surrounded Vatican City on all sides. From the Apostolic Palace, Pius XII watched them through a slit in the curtains. The German flag flew openly across Rome, a foreign banner over the ancient capital of the Catholic world. The order arrives in Berlin. Hitler met with his military adjutants and delivered a command that no one could misunderstand. "We will occupy the Vatican. The Pope is to be brought to Germany." He envisioned a headline that would shock the world. "The Pope in custody for treason against the Reich." The plan, labeled by SS documents as a security operation, was anything but defensive. SS General Karl Wolff received the order personally. He was to seize Vatican radio and diplomatic archives, arrest the Pope and his closest cardinals, transport them north, first to northern Italy. Then across the Alps, Wolff's voice remained calm when Hitler spoke. Inside, he felt panic. He understood what Hitler did not. This was not a military target. This was the heart of a billion souls. Destroying the Vatican's neutrality could change the course of the war. But Hitler was beyond caution. Rome had turned into a symbol of betrayal. Italy had switched sides. Mussolini had failed him. And the Vatican, in Hitler's eyes, was enabling Catholic resistance networks. He wanted dominance, immediately. Wolff left Berlin with a folder marked, "Vatican, highest priority." Rome becomes a cage by late September. SS patrols fanned out across the streets bordering Vatican City. Heavy boots crushed fallen leaves. Tracked vehicles parked at intersections leading toward St. Peter's Square. At night, their engines idled, like predators waiting for movement. The Swiss Guard inside the Vatican watched in silence. They could not provoke the Germans. They could not fire unless fired upon. Inside Vatican offices, typewriters clacked. Documents were being duplicated, translated, burned. Cardinal Maglione, the Vatican Secretary of State, issued sealed envelopes to senior priests with instructions. If the Pope vanished, a new conclave must form outside Italy. Within illuminated rooms, senior clergy laid out maps of escape routes through Spain and Portugal, but the Pope rejected them. "I will remain," he said. He would not abandon. Rome. The Germans prepare the strike. Wolff began gathering a strike force from the SS. Panzer Grenadier Division stationed just outside the city. Their commander was a ruthless officer known for brutal counterinsurgency. Tactics. The raid was to begin under cover of darkness. 3 assault teams were assigned. Team 1, breach the Vatican gates. Team 2, seize Vatican radio. Team 3, extract the Pope. Wolff ordered a reconnaissance officer to enter Vatican City disguised as a tourist. He walked the courtyards, timed guard rotations, mapped internal corridors. He returned with a critical detail. The Swiss Guard would fight. They were ceremonial soldiers, yes, but they were willing to die protecting the pontiff. Wolf paused. Bloodshed inside the Vatican would trigger global outrage. Still, the operation moved forward. The signal that triggered fear. Just after midnight, October 13th, 1943, the Vatican received an urgent visitor. Monsignor Montini, the man later known as Pope Paul VI, hurried through the hallways to the Pope's quarters, carrying a message that had been smuggled from an Italian resistance informant. He laid the paper on the desk. It read, "The SS is preparing to strike the Vatican." The Pope sat still. The words confirmed what he had feared for months. Hitler was no longer just planning, he was moving. The Vatican's final preparation, Pius XIII, walked to a small wooden drawer in his study. Inside was the cloth pouch. He held it for a moment, then handed it to Montini. "If they enter the Vatican," he said quietly, "this must be done. Burn the ring. Destroy the seal. End the papacy, before the Nazis could weaponize it." He then took a piece of paper already prepared. It was a resignation decree. Signed, dated. Ready. For the first time in history, the papacy could vanish in a single breath if enemies crossed the border. The SS would not kidnap the Pope. They would kidnap Eugenio Pacelli, a private citizen. The night of the near raid, that same night, headlights flickered along Via della Conciliazione. German trucks moved in formation. Engines growled like thunder in the narrow street leading straight to St. Peter's Square. Inside Vatican City, Swiss guards locked the bronze doors of St. Anne's Gate. Priests waited in basement vaults. Nuns huddled with the hidden refugees. Some whispered prayers. Others listened for boots. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. The Germans kept their engines running, but they did not move. General Wolf was inside one of the trucks, holding the order. He knew a single command would change world history. But he also knew what would follow: riots in South America, protests in North America, millions of Catholics enraged. Wolf ordered the trucks to stand down. The engines shut off. The raid was postponed. The Pope remained free, for now. But Hitler did not retreat. He demanded progress. He demanded action. And he demanded the Vatican pay a price for defiance. The plan did not die. It simply shifted. And what happened next revealed the turning point. But Hitler did not retreat. He demanded progress. He demanded action. And he demanded the Vatican pay a price for defiance. The plan did not die. It simply shifted. And what happened next revealed the turning point. Mid-March 1944, Rome inside. The German command headquarters on Via Tasso. SS officers huddled over a table. Not diplomats. Not Wehrmacht strategists. Men handpicked by Himmler. The order arriving through Berlin cables was unsettlingly simple. Neutralize the Vatican's ability to interfere. Neutralize. Not destroy. Not yet. But remove its influence. Remove its voice. Remove its leader. Hitler no longer wanted just pressure. He wanted the Pope. He wanted Pius XII in custody. Somewhere far away. Where he could no longer speak to the world. No longer offer shelter to Jews. No longer be seen as a moral counterweight to the Reich. Within days, a chilling directive circulated among SS officers in Rome. Capture the Pope. Seize Vatican communications. Occupy the Apostolic Palace. Only a handful of German officers knew the full scope. Even fewer supported it. And one of them, secretly, betrayed it. That officer was General Karl Wolff, Himmler's trusted commander in Italy. At first, Wolff cooperated. He reviewed logistic plans. He examined entry points into the Vatican. He even evaluated which SS units would storm the Basilica. But as the operation grew more real, a terrifying realization began to creep in. Executing this plan would make him responsible for the most explosive event in modern Christian history. He imagined the consequences: millions of Catholics revolting, uprisings across Nazi-occupied nations, the moral backlash of kidnapping the Pope. Wolff knew Hitler didn't care, but Wolff did quietly. He began to panic. So he took a risk that could have cost him his life. He privately arranged a meeting with Pope Pius XII through an intermediary, a secret courier working with the Vatican. Wolff confessed that a plan existed. He confirmed that special SS units were preparing. He warned the Pope, leave, evacuate, disappear if you must. The Pope looked at Wolff's envoy and shook his head. He would not run. He would not flee Rome. He accepted that if the Germans invaded the Vatican, he would be arrested or killed as a prisoner of God. Wolf, realizing the Pope would not save himself, made a decision that would save the Vatican. He stalled the operation. He delayed reports to Berlin. He issued new security reassessments. He buried paperwork under mountains of other directives. Every day he bought, the war moved closer to Germany's defeat. He was gambling with his life, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Hitler was growing impatient. The SS prepared for the strike. Maps of Vatican tunnels were studied. Routes of approach were marked. The names of officers assigned to seize the Pope were chosen. But outside Rome, the thunder of artillery was getting closer. American shells, Allied engines, the war was shifting, and suddenly, Hitler's operation, months in preparation, collided with a reality he could no longer outrun. The Allies were now at Rome's doorstep. As Allied forces closed in, Wolf made one final choice. He pushed the kidnapping plan into administrative paralysis. He used the only weapon he had left, time, and time ran out because the moment American armored divisions breached the last German defenses south of Rome, the Pope became untouchable. The Allies weren't just liberating a city. They were crushing Hitler's final chance to strike the Vatican. The plan didn't end with a firefight. No dramatic raid, no storming of basilicas, ended with the sound of tank engines. The Reich was collapsing, and Hitler's most audacious plan vanished, under the weight of his own losing war. Rome, June 1944, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang for the first time without fear. For 9 months, Rome had been a prison city, controlled by SS patrols, watched by Gestapo agents, suffocated by suspicion. Now, with the arrival of Allied forces, the atmosphere changed in a single breath. Crowds surged through streets that had been silent. Windows that remained shuttered through occupation flung open. Children appeared, holding flags that had been hidden in drawers. Inside the Vatican, telegrams flooded the Secretariat of State. Rome liberated. The Pope is safe. The kidnapping order has failed. But outside the Vatican walls, something else happened. Something quieter and much more revealing. As Germans fled north, they abandoned records, documents, intercepted messages, strategy sheets. The Allies captured several. The Vatican obtained others through the Italian resistance. Piece by piece, a chilling truth emerged. The kidnapping plan was not rumor, not speculation, not post-war myth. It was real. It had been authorized at the highest level of the Nazi state, and it had nearly happened. Summer 1944. Allied Interrogation Center. Italy captured German officers were questioned about Rome. Most denied everything, until a name surfaced repeatedly: Karl Wolff, the SS general who had been in charge of security in Italy, the man who had received the directive directly from Himmler. When interrogators pressed him, Wolff finally spoke. He described receiving written orders to enter the Vatican, secure the radio, arrest the Pope. He explained how SS units had already rehearsed routes through Vatican gates, how transports were assigned to move Pius XII north to Germany, likely to Liechtenstein Castle, Himmler's private stronghold. He admitted the plan was paused only because the military situation changed before we could act. But behind the clinical wording was something deeper. Wolff had hesitated. He feared the consequences, not only for Germany, but for himself. Kidnapping the Pope could ignite a religious revolt across Europe. In his testimony, Wolff uttered a sentence that shook interrogators. Had we succeeded, every Catholic soldier in the German army would have turned against us. This was not fear of the Vatican. It was fear of its followers, millions of Catholics served in Wehrmacht uniforms. To kidnap their spiritual leader, the Pope, would have detonated the very army Hitler relied upon. It was the first time Wolff acknowledged what historians would later confirm. The Vatican wasn't spared because Germany lacked capability. It was spared because Nazi leadership feared what came after. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, Pius XII faced a different kind of aftermath. People demanded answers. Why didn't he leave the Vatican? Why remain silent publicly while Rome suffered? Why act only in the shadows? The Pope listened. He walked daily through the Vatican gardens, always alone, hands behind his back, deep in thought. Priests said he often stopped before the small grotto at the far end, eyes closed, whispering prayers for the dead. He had chosen to stay not because it was safe, but because leaving would have been interpreted as abandoning the city. He told close aides, "Wherever the Pope is, there the Church is. If I am taken, the Church becomes a prisoner with me." His stance wasn't heroic bravado, it was strategic. Had he fled, Hitler would have declared the Vatican vacant, installing a puppet cardinal loyal to the Reich, legitimizing tyranny under the guise of religion. Pius XII's presence inside those walls was more powerful than any sermon or speech. He made Rome impossible to control without consequence. Post-liberation. Vatican secret archives. Within days of Rome's liberation, Vatican archivists began sealing and cataloging documents related to the kidnapping plan, witness accounts, Gestapo activity logs, high-risk resistance communications. It wasn't about hiding history. It was about preserving evidence. The Vatican knew something the world had not yet realized. When peace returned, historians would argue, politicians would rewrite, nations would reshape narratives, but the records would hold the truth, and they did. Sealed in climate-controlled chambers deep beneath the Apostolic Palace, those records remained untouched for decades, until the world was finally ready to confront them. Yet even with evidence preserved and testimonies recorded, one question remained. Just how close did Hitler truly come to capturing the Pope? That answer, the final, most unnerving piece of the puzzle, would surface in a series of shocking confessions after the war. Revelations that shifted the moral weight of what happened in Rome. Revelations that forced historians to rethink Pius XIV, and revelations that proved Hitler's plan came within hours of execution. 945. Germany collapses. The war ended in fire. Germany surrendered. Nazi command shattered. Hitler shot himself in a bunker deep beneath Berlin. And when the dust of the Reich settled, survivors began to speak. Not soldiers, not diplomats, but the men who had stood closest to the darkest plan of all. Nuremberg trials. 1946. Karl Wolff, now a prisoner, was escorted into an interrogation room. Not as a witness, as a man implicated in war crimes. He was gaunt, tired, haunted by what he knew. He repeated the story, this time under oath. Hitler ordered me to prepare an operation, to seize the Vatican and arrest the Pope. Investigators demanded specifics. Wolff gave them names, dates, preparation, stages. He described how elite SS units trained to blend into Vatican crowds, how armored trucks were positioned near Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence, ready to move him north at night, how pre-written propaganda claimed the Pope was under protective custody of the Reich. Finally, one interrogator asked, when would the operation have taken place? Wolff stared at the table in silence. Then he answered, the moment the Allies stepped into Rome, meaning, if American tanks had been delayed even 2 days, the Vatican might have fallen. The world reacted with disbelief. Kidnapping the Pope wasn't a symbolic act. It would have triggered chaos across Europe, Latin America, and the Catholic world. Everyone wanted to know, what would Hitler have done with him? The answer came from another man. Eugen Dolman, Hitler's personal interpreter for Italian affairs, testified independently. He confirmed the existence of the plan. He added something Wolff had not. The Pope was to be transported to Liechtenstein Castle in Austria. Isolated, cut off, forgotten. Dolman revealed something even darker. If the Vatican resisted, explosives were prepared to destroy St. Peter's Basilica. This was not just about kidnapping. It was about erasing a spiritual symbol that had existed for 2,000 years. A religious Hiroshima. 947. Rome more. Testimonies surfaced. Italian resistance members, priests, diplomats. Each provided a piece of the puzzle. One account, from Monsignor Giovanni Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, described the Vatican's emergency plan. If German troops breached the walls, Pius XIV would immediately resign. Not as surrender, as strategy. He would cease to be Pope the moment he was arrested, preventing Hitler from legitimizing his capture. The College of Cardinals would relocate in secret to Portugal or Spain and elect a new pontiff. Hitler could seize the man, but he could not seize the papacy. That single decision, handwritten, signed and sealed, protected the Church from becoming a hostage of fascism. Then came the most astonishing revelation of all. It came from a hidden document written by a German officer stationed at the Vatican's perimeter. In 1944, he confessed, "We waited for the order. It never came. Why? Because Karl Wolff stalled. He intentionally delayed reports. He buried the raid under paperwork. He sabotaged the clock, knowing Allied tanks were only days away." In the Vatican archives today, filed under wartime correspondence, one note from Wolff survives. It contains only 4 words, handwritten in pencil. Time is on your side. And so, the unimaginable happened. A world war. An empire built on terror, a dictator who silenced nations, was stopped not by armies, but by time and hesitation. Hitler wanted to crush a religion. He failed because one of his own generals feared the backlash of touching a man who carried no weapon. Pope with no army had faced the Führer with silence, and survived. Years later, in interviews, Karl Wolff was asked, "Why did you protect the Pope?" His answer was simple. "I chose the lesser evil." He didn't do it out of morality, he did it out of fear. History is not shaped only by heroes. Sometimes, it is steered by men too afraid to unleash the consequences of what they were ordered to do. And so we arrive at the deeper truth. St. Peter's Basilica still stands. The Vatican still exists. The Pope remained free. Not because Hitler lacked the power, but because he failed to act before time ran out. The kidnapping plan withered like the Reich that conceived it. The Eternal City lived up to its name. History often remembers great battles, tanks grinding across fields, artillery lighting up the night, soldiers pushing front lines forward 1 bloody meter at a time. But sometimes, the decisive moment in a world war doesn't happen on a battlefield. Sometimes, it happens in silence, behind closed doors, in the hesitation of a single man choosing not to obey an order. Hitler imagined himself unchallengeable, a ruler who could bend nations to his will. Yet when he aimed at the Vatican, at a city with no army, at a spiritual leader with no weapons, his power fractured, not by force, but by consequence. The kidnapping of the Pope would have ignited millions. Catholic soldiers in the Wehrmacht, civilians across occupied Europe, governments watching from afar. Hitler could silence governments, newspapers and dissent, but he could not silence faith. Without detonating the world beneath his feet, that fear stopped him. Fear of uprisings? He could not control. Fear of losing soldiers he desperately needed. Fear of what would happen if he crossed a moral line so deep. It had held firm for 2,000 years. In the end, it was not Allied firepower that saved the Vatican. It was time. It was hesitation. It was the quiet resistance inside the enemy's own hierarchy. A dictator with millions at his command, defeated by the weight of what he dared not unleash. And then there was the Pope. Pius XII never ran, never hid. He stood in the eye of the storm, knowing a single knock on the door could end everything. He defended Rome not with swords, but with presence. His refusal to flee robbed Hitler of legitimacy. His silence frustrated those who wanted public defiance, yet that same silence kept the Vatican from becoming a battlefield. In war, survival is rarely clean. Sometimes the world is saved not by heroes, but by timing, restraint, and decisions made in the shadows. Rome endured. The Vatican remained sovereign. The papacy survived, and Hitler's darkest order faded into dust, because in the end, evil miscalculates, empires built on fear crumble, symbols built on faith endure.